It would make lines of kind of all sorts of whatever is in that ecosystem that got pulverized for the flood would stick on the paper. And then, I would leave it for like 6 weeks at a time.
Sure.
And then canoe back out once it was low enough and collect the paper and then dried it flat and then hired a couple of friends to go around each and every little piece with tiny glue so that it would stay.
Right.
So that when you look at them, it's like, how was this even made? It looks almost, some of them got so much stuff on them, it feels like they were laying in the forest floor. But it's actually the forest floor was floating in the water and making these lines.
Right. So the gluing, are we talking about gluing it onto, are we talking about the things that are sticking to it?
The sticking to it, like the little seeds or branches, to keep them there.
Right.
I mean, they were dried onto it, but to keep them there over time.
Right.
So that when they were, it's a living artwork, right? It's going to change over time because it's stained with tannins from the oak leaves and the, all that. But so tiny, tiny brushes that went around each like a little leaf that stuck, like tucking glue underneath it so that it wouldn't pop off when I moved it or framed it. Right.
And so it's this tiny geological record, right? I mean, it's really beautiful.
Well, thank you. I'm crazy for them,
right?
But they're kind of wacky. They're unusual.
Well, I mean, but they're nice in that, absent of the backstory of what it represents, they're beautiful pieces of contemporary abstract work, right? And it's and then just the whole process, process-based abstraction, right, is just the next level that I'm sure really attracts people to the work, right? And so, your most, when I first saw your work, and I apologize, I hadn't seen all your work beforehand, but I think the first time I saw your work was when you were in the Slope Gallery over at the Amon Carter, the installation of archiving Eden, and that it was just it's so engaging, and it just really captures your imagination. And I think part of that is just the nature of the scale, right? When we think about, because some of those prints, like the X-ray print of seeds, they're quite large, like maybe 40 by 60 or something, of an object that in nature is microscopic, right? And so it's really interesting to see what world's hiding there, right?
Yeah.
And so what attracted you to that project? How did you become attracted to this topic? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about where that came from.
So I started archiving Eden 10 years ago.
Right.
And I'm still working on it because I love that project. But I had read an article in the New Yorker called Sowing for the Apocalypse by John Seabrook.
Right.
And it gave a story of the opening of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault that had just opened. So it was 2008, so it had just opened, or it was about to open when I read it. And I was fascinated because I didn't know at the time what a seed bank was.
Right.
And I was like, oh my gosh, here is the story of one individual person working 35 years to kind of build a Noah's Ark for plants at the North Pole.
Right.
And what I was immediately attracted to was like the ultimate pessimism of that, this kind of apocalyptic vision, the end of the world. But then the other half of it was this idea of like the hope embedded in that we're going to save biodiversity, we're going to collect every plant in the world, and we're going to put it safeguarded in the North Pole so that if the worst comes to worst, we'll be able to regenerate.
Right.
And so I immediately wanted to photograph it.
Sure.
I was like, that's amazing. And then, the article talked about other places, a really big one that was built right before World War II in Russia. Mm-hmm. And then that scientist kind of fell out of favor with Stalin and died. And so there are all these heroic narratives, woven into the story of preserving biodiversity and individual actions and how that might affect the future of the planet. And so that part of it, of individual action making a difference, for me was like a really compelling narrative, because sometimes, the problems with climate change seems so big that it feels like, even though we're all, trying to avoid using plastic and not use, fossil fuels, all of that is still, it feels like it's just a drop in the bucket compared to this huge problem. So that narrative that, you could really actually make a difference was very, very profoundly moving to me. Sure.
And so, so that project took a couple of different venues, right? Like, one is documenting like the places and spaces versus kind of a more creative look at the actual, the seeds themselves as being a jumping off point for, your creativity, right? And so, I assume that you spent a lot of time with the scientists that are managing these places and spaces, right? And so, how did your relationship with them? I mean, it seems like, a person with a scientific background would really be attracted to this, and so do you have like a natural proclivity to research in the sciences, or just a natural appreciation?
I'd say I have a big interest in natural history, and so I read a lot of natural history and biology. I do kind of, evolutionary, natural history, right? Stephen Jay Gould, right? Who I wondered if you.
No, I'm not related, but
but a great writer, right? And a contemporary person would be Richard Plum, who just wrote that really beautiful book, The Evolution of History. Right. I mean, The Evolution of Beauty.
Okay.
So, no, I just have an interest in it, but my interest in it is the visual part of it, and the kind of overarching story, and this seek to, this kind of quest to preserve life beyond the natural span of things. So that, they're trying to, like, through cryogenic processes, extend life, the life expectancy of these seeds for 200 years or more. Right. And then as talking to the scientists was super fun, because they would always, there'd be some moment where they would, through discussion, they would raise some question or, something they took for granted that would send me off in another area to kind of research or read about, So that part of it, that unanticipated directions that would come from conversation was super, super interesting.
Sure.
So, but it was interesting. They didn't think that seed banks were visually appealing, because they have tons and tons of pictures that are kind of in that purely descriptive form. Right. That when they are published, there's usually kind of just a journalistic picture of a cryogenic tank or the inside of the vault. So they were like, "There's no pictures here. We're happy to collaborate with you, but there's really no pictures." Sure. And the first, the second seed bank, I started at Lady Bird Johnson in Austin because they were collaborating with the British seed bank to collect dryland flora. Right. So they're looking for plants that would, if the world became more desert-like, plants that might sustain food or might sustain us in a really much more arid climate.
Right.
So they were collecting out in West Texas. So I started with them and photographed, and then found out about the National Bank that's in Fort Collins.
Right.
And there was a research scientist there, not a director of the facility, but the research scientist there, his name was Dave Ellis. And so when I photographed there, right at the get-go, I saw that they were, they had a little X-ray machine that they were X-raying collections of seeds for statistical analysis of their viability. Like how many of these were damaged by insects before they came into the collection, what could they see about that, and do a little analysis of maybe 100 seeds at a time. And when I, looking at the physical condition and morphology of the seeds, and I saw that, and I was like, well, can I use that? And he was like, well, okay.
Right.
This super expensive piece of equipment. And then, and they had not been looking at tissue samples. A lot of our food source are clones.
Right.
And they keep them in large freezers.
Right.
But then they also grow them to be little seedlings or saplings in the case of trees that are maybe a couple of inches high.
Right.
And they had not been looking at the tissue samples with the X-ray. And so I asked if I could do that, and they said yes. He said yes to that and arranged for that. And then that eventually turned into him growing seed. I'd say, hey, I'm going to come in a couple months, and he would grow seeds so that I could photograph them. So
what? That X-ray machinery, was it actually spitting out physical, or was it a video of the X-ray, or was it actually spitting out an X-ray print?
I see your point. No, what it does is it's a digital capture now.
Okay, and so at that point, so your image is a digital capture from what they were seeing through the X-ray.
So I would get a group. We can edit this out if you'd like. But
I feel like a lot of people that listen to my podcast are probably really nerdy anyway, and probably want to know like the technical.
Okay, so I'm like, okay, all right. Warning to the listener.
I always get really curious about process, and I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. So what we would do is they would be working on seeds, or I would have an interest on something, and I would say, hey, this research we're doing on corn, for instance, all the varieties of corn. Can I have a set? They have study seeds because the X-ray is not good for them.
Right.
Doesn't help them.
It radiates or
right.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so they would give me a collection of seeds. I would put them in a little tray. I would put them in the X-ray machine.
Okay.
I would adjust the X-ray machine to get an image that I liked, which is not necessarily useful for them for research purposes. And then I would take that digital file, right?
Okay.
And then that digital file I would take back to my studio in Texas.
Right.
And then I would manipulate it and collage it, which is all that work that you saw in the Amon Carter or in the book is not a straight image from an X-ray machine. It's been manipulated in a variety of ways to make it either clearer for what I'm after, or they're small, so sometimes I stitch them together to make big prints.
Sure. So you're saying you're an artist?
Why? Yes.
And so you stitch together, and then I see that some of those that were stitched together, you used like a lenticular process for display, and that would allow the colors to shift as you pass by, right?
Yeah, so the plants themselves, it's not, and many times when you use a lenticular process that people would be familiar with is for movement between, like a GIF, right? Or a GIF.
Right.
And so you would have a 3-frame animation, maybe somebody's eyes would open and close or whatever. And what I do is I make a color shift rather than movement to talk about I wanted a still image that would talk about the impossibility of stopping time. So that really you would have these living materials that even though they're still changing. So they change from green to blue or brown to green.
Right.
Green to brown, talking about either the freezing or the drying process.
Sure. That's really interesting because, even being frozen, it just slowing down
right.
the process. It's not